All right. So I'm very happy to be here today at Metta Center, and because it's a small group, we can have more interactive environment. Basically, today's talk is the intersection of social engagement and spiritual practice. That's kind of the gist of it, right? Yeah. And there are so many things to say and discuss in this topic, but it might be good to just go around and say your name and what interests you about this topic, what you feel about the current climate in the world, and how spiritual practice could impact that or make that better, just in a small way. So I'm Ayya Yeshe, and I'll be talking about this subject all day, so I won't say anything right now.
Okay, so my name is Dhammavada, or Tony, Leonard. So as you know, I have been running a charity over in Africa for a number of years, and before that with St. Vincent de Paul. So for me the issue is very personal, and it's one that I'm sure you have also been grappling with, which is getting that right balance of how do you contribute to the world and have that concern and compassion and taking personal responsibility, and yet at the same time support yourself to be the vessel that enables that to occur, and looking after oneself and having the freedom and spontaneity and joy that enables one to be as effective as possible. And so certainly interested in hearing your thoughts and ideas around that, and hopefully growing with it myself. It's something that is, I guess, an ongoing struggle to find the ideal win-win in terms of that.
That's true. You had an important point there, self-care and joy, because it's so easy to get buried in an issue. Like once you start opening up the Pandora's box of social justice, you just see there are so many issues and it's such a heavy load. How do you not get flattened by that? And how do you support yourself to do that, financially and emotionally?
My name is Andrea, and I'm open to learn whatever you're teaching today. Specific in mind.
My name is Brenda. I run an accounting firm myself at home, and the reason why I'm here actually, both my husband Don and myself, we want to do more to contribute to the aged care industry in Australia, and we just did a CPE course, a chaplain course a few weeks back, and then we just started like a volunteer, probably a couple of days a week to St. Vincent's aged care. Okay. And but during that process, I found that, especially from the course, there's a lot of suffering, and then when it's probably more how to help the others and how to self-care as well during that process. So that's the main reason why I'm here. I want to learn more about how to help others and help myself.
Yeah, good field too.
Yeah.
What do you do at home, you said?
I run a small accounting firm by myself, just one person accounting firm.
Okay.
Yeah.
One woman.
One woman.
Wonder team.
One boss. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Pardon?
A little bit of help from me.
A little bit helpful?
A little bit of help from me too.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, help from my husband too. Yeah, my husband's doing marketing and admin work for me.
Awesome.
So actually, yeah. He's my employee. I'm sorry. But he's a manager as well. Yeah, we're two managers.
That's
not
going to be interesting.
But yeah, I'm sorry.
It's the boss.
I'm sorry, I forgot about you. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's going to be an interesting conversation with you. Let's go.
That's true.
Oh, hello everyone. It's really nice to see you here today. My name is Don. As Brenda explained, we just recently did an introductory course into clinical pastoral education, and we wish to move into the area of aged care. And to pick up both on what Tony and Brenda were talking about, self-care is a really important thing, because we're encouraged to enter a person's space or a room or a ward without knowing, and to be able to sit with what situation we find and to be able to help that person. And as Brenda spoke about, inevitably it brings up suffering in us, and perhaps sometimes we're projecting suffering onto other people, but I'm really looking forward to today, because the whole idea of socially engaged Buddhism is to be able to take our contemplative practice out and actually, well, engage with others and care for others, but care for ourselves too.
My name's Betty. I'm Tony's mother. I've done quite a few things in the past, not at the moment, but in the past with Lama in Canberra, and whom I certainly admire the way he does things. He has certainly interacted very much with a large community in Canberra, and I got something in the mail the other day to say that they're starting, in a couple of years they probably will have a large Buddhist temple up there. I don't know if you are aware of that. You could be. Today I'm here because of Tony, who said he wanted to meet this very interesting lady who's a Buddhist nun, so that's why I'm here. And so the interactive part, well, I don't do quite as much as I used to, but obviously I do interact with many people, so there's certain avenues of certain groups that the meditation would definitely be an advantage in doing those things.
And I wouldn't have been able to do all the things I did in Africa without Mum's moral support and financial support and support in so many ways. So you're also very much a charity leader.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, maybe.
My name's Terry. The idea of Buddhists like socially engaging and getting involved in social things interests me, because even though your Buddhism has all of these lovely things of kindness and compassion and that, they're not very active in this field. I know a friend of mine who came here to Australia as a refugee from Cambodia. He and his family were impressed by all the help they got from the Christians. And they got none from the Buddhists. And I think that's typical. So it's lovely to sort of come to a place like this and rub shoulders with other people who have that same sort of a mindset.
Yeah.
So,
I'm hearing you. I'm feeling what you're laying down. So there are so many things to talk about with this issue, but where to begin? Last night I went to a Dharma talk by a very famous Tibetan Lama, and there were 300 people there, and it was a group comprised of new people, like people who perhaps heard of mindfulness and like the idea of Buddhism but don't know much about it. And there's also a lot of people who've been long-term Buddhists, particularly people from the baby boomer and the Generation X, who tend to dominate the Buddhist diaspora, people in their 50s and above. And it was really interesting. I mean, it was a wonderful talk, kind of on the three turnings of the wheel of Buddhism, which I won't go into here. But at the end, as I do, as an activist and a socially engaged Buddhist, and as someone who has experienced marginalization because I'm a woman, because I'm a Western nun, not a Tibetan monk, I ask this question, which I often do, which sometimes people are like, oh, there's that nun again. I ask this question, the Buddhist community is not united because they're not emotionally there for each other, because we're not, like we haven't been emotionally there for monastics because we're not emotionally there for each other. Because we all think Buddhism is a self-help therapy, not a religion. And if you have like a religion, like a Christian religion, or any kind of religion, you think it's a socially cohesive group of organised people who work together for common aims. And of course, there's a great deal of secularism in Australia, and we're afraid of this term religion. People who have come to Buddhism, not born in it, usually have come because they perhaps experienced another religion and felt it was very dogmatic and controlling, and there were lots of scandals with, priests abusing children and whatever else. Or they just didn't feel an affinity with that sense of belief system. So they don't want to hear that those things, those elements, like in terms of a socially cohesive group, requiring social responsibility. They don't want to be told that. That's challenging for them. What they want is peace. What drives them into Buddhism is peace and self-realization. And especially the baby boomer generation, the me generation, seeking freedom, right? What was it? Tune in, turn on, drop out. Okay. So it was all about breaking down the traditional structures that had kept people quite hemmed in. And that time in the 60s was such an interesting time in terms of discovering new ways of thinking and new cultures and new things. And it was all cosmic and amazing, and a time of great change, And my mother actually said to me, she's a little bit older than the baby boomer generation, and she said, I grew up with this set of values that became completely useless by the time I was 25. I was told to be a good wife, to be a good loving mother, and that was the point of life. You grow up, you get married, you have a family, and you live together with the 1.8 kids and a dog and a white picket fence. That was the model. You grow up to that. And then it was like, when she finally did that, everybody else was like burning their bra and, getting in a van and driving to India. And she was like there, married with kids and just kind of living out of time, because suddenly the world changed completely. It turned on its axis, And it's important to understand the historical development of Buddhism in the West, which has affected how we view Buddhism now, and to understand that generation of Buddhists, of Western Buddhists, who approached Buddhism as a self-help therapy and as a kind of a way of liberating yourself from all the social norms of the previous generation, of embracing Eastern culture, Eastern religion, anything new, as a curiosity, but also as an exoticism, like especially in the 90s, there was, now the millennials would call it cultural appropriation. But in the 90s, it was very normal to see, in the alternate scene, it was very normal to see a cappella groups, like white women singing songs from Africa, and, actually, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing if you're doing it in a very respectful way, but you have to be really careful. And we thought Buddhism was, I know because I was a hippie as well, and I was living with people who were the real hippie generation. Like, we thought it was cool to walk around in a sari, or to buy a Lhasa Apso dog, or to burn incense and fill your house with Buddha statues. And we weren't doing that necessarily because we wanted to culturally appropriate, but we were doing it because we were disillusioned with our own culture, and our own culture was not providing answers to the questions we sought. You know, but there is a kind of misunderstanding that Buddhism is belonging to a particular people or a particular culture, and not seeing, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, not seeing the wood for the trees. You know, like seeing all these deities, all these mantras, all these cultural trappings, and not understanding what the essence of the Dharma is, and not understanding that Dharma is not a person or a culture, it is a way of truth. And that way of truth transcends form, transcends, it's like a boat, you know. The Buddha said it's like a boat. The Dharma is a raft that you take to the far shore. The far shore is a term you often hear in the early sutras of liberation. And once you reach the far shore, you don't carry the raft around on your back. You know, but as long as you're not enlightened, hold fast to that raft. And see over time this truth, this formless, transcendent way of freedom has, I mean, Cambodian people build a Cambodian raft, and Vietnamese people build a Vietnamese raft, and Western people build a Titanic raft. You know? But it's so burdened with our confusion about, like, because we're a little confused about, like, we've got all our cultural baggage that we're putting on Buddhism. We're trying to run Buddhism as a like, Buddhism is trying to fit into the capitalist business model in terms of how we run a Buddhist center. Look at what's happened to yoga. Yoga was only ever meant to be an introduction to meditation. It was a spiritual path. It was part of Hinduism. The idea of going to a temple and from a swami, learning and having a set fixed price on that would be unthinkable in India, you know. And the idea that you would just use yoga to get a nice butt would be unthinkable in India. You know, thousands of years of masters devoting their whole life, not just 2 weeks of yoga teacher training, but their whole life to realizing this inner truth. You know, and now yoga has become like, okay, here we have an ex-model doing a yoga video, and look at how I can wrap my leg around my head on the beach with perfect photography. I mean, people have to make a living, and people want to make a meaningful living. So, you know, it's not necessarily a really bad thing if they're spreading something that is of substance. But if they are commodifying something of substance to be something watered down and shallow, then it's problematic. So, you know, we as Westerners think that we can just take this thing and twist it to whatever we want. You know, but how far will it stretch before it doesn't even resemble what it was originally? And is Buddhism a Lhasa Apso dog and a throne and incense and katas and red robes and tapestries? And that's nice, but that's not what Buddhism is. Buddhism is truth, you know. And we have to have faith in our own capacity as Westerners to hold this tradition, you know, and our own capacity to have Buddha nature, to have awakening. But we also have to respect the essential teachings and the essential values of Buddhism, and understand that Buddhism needs to be preserved and should not just be used by us to prop up our agenda. You know, you don't change the Dharma to suit your ego. You change yourself to suit the Dharma. That's what Ajahn Brahm says, and I think that's very true. We have to be very careful. One, that we don't mistake culture for Buddhism, and two, that we don't change Buddhism just to massage our ego. Because the purpose of Buddhism is to not make you comfortable and peaceful and joyful all the time. That's part of it. That could be an entry point. But the real purpose is to completely unseat your ego, completely tear apart your self-cherishing, your illusions, you know, to not make you comfortable. That's the deeper level, you know. And that's the conflict between commodifying the Dharma and selling it as a self-help or a stress relief thing. That's the where it doesn't sit so well. Because can you make someone comfortable with samsara while at the same time ripping apart samsara? Maybe there is. I think there is a meeting point. Excuse me. There is a meeting point here, because people cannot practice the Dharma if they don't have well-being, and if they don't have their anxiety and their mind under control. So I think there is a role for secular mindfulness there, because a lot of people will never come to Buddhism as a religion. But that doesn't mean that Buddhism doesn't have a set of beliefs and social responsibility that would be called a religion in the least dogmatic sense possible.
And the word religion comes from religio, which is to bind together as a group, to bind together with beliefs and understandings.
Yeah.
But also potentially to bind together in a negative way as well.
Totally, totally. And that's what we're afraid of. We're afraid of dogma. We're afraid of fundamentalism. And we should be, you know. But the other risk is in the West that we're so individualistic, and we're so, I'll just believe whatever I want to believe and I'll just take whatever I want to take, that we're not really letting the Dharma change us. We're not really being vulnerable. We should question and examine. We very much should. But once you've taken some of the Dharma and it's started to change you, you need to unite with others to preserve the Dharma, to work together as a community, to build cohesiveness, to achieve things to benefit others, to keep the Dharma alive. There is a need for us to work together, you know, and we are this kind of like I know best and kind of rampant individualism is detrimental to, like, okay, one extreme is what you have in India, where everybody is the family comes first, the community comes first, and that sometimes means women's rights are trampled, Dalits' rights are trampled, because the community comes first. So that's one extreme that we want to, that's not so great for certain people, you know, for their individual freedom and development. The other extreme is what we have in the West, which is rampant individualism, where people are completely isolated from each other and wrapped up in their own consumerism and self-attachment, and kind of replaced other human beings with things, you know, and we're very picky, you know, we're not very tolerant. We don't want anything that doesn't make us uncomfortable. Like in the old days, you grew up with a joint family and you just kind of learned to tolerate people who were a little annoying. You just know that's part of living in community. But in the West, we're like, you know, with the nuclear family, and people are just splitting off, like 50% divorce rate, and splitting off, to the point where we just have these people who can't live with anyone. Yeah. And that's problematic. You know, that is problematic because, I mean, do you want to live in a society where the only way you know if your neighbour died is because of the smell coming from their apartment? Do we want to live in a society like that, where you go to the train station and there's people sleeping on the platform, you know, completely disenfranchised?
It's almost like a complete abandonment of your obligation.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I feel very sad.
Yeah. So coming back to this point of that, I went to this Lama's talk last night, and I asked.
What's the Lama's name?
Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche.
No.
Yeah.
No, well, suppose.
Yeah. So I went to his talk, and I asked this question. And as an activist, your job is sometimes to be a mirror, to be an annoying mirror, and ask the questions that make people uncomfortable, you know, while trying to have compassion at the same time. And I just said, you know, we as a Buddhist community are not united. We don't have a vision for the long-term preservation of the Dharma. We think Buddhism is a self-help therapy, and that's why we don't have one centre in Australia for Tibetan Western monastics that doesn't charge us, and we have a 75% disrobing rate. But for hundreds of years, the fourfold Sangha, monks, nuns, laywomen, laymen, has been an essential part of preserving the Dharma. Can you say something about the value of monastics? Do they have a part to play in the future of Buddhism? You know, we have such a high regard for Tibetan Lamas and such a low regard for our own Australian monastics. And he actually said, yeah, you know, the veneer is important, monastics are important, Tibetan Lamas should stop patronising Western monastics and should, you know, give them support. And Australia is an ideal place for starting a monastery for Western monastics, which is an important part of the flourishing of the Fourfold Sangha and the future of Buddhism. And everybody was like, yeah, your question was really good, and what he said was really nice. But the question was left unaddressed at the end of the day because they all expected someone else to do it. You know, like, oh yeah, monastics should have support, but I'm not going to do it. Someone else is going to do it. Even someone said to me, because on Sakya Rinpoche mentioned, oh, the Vietnamese community is very generous, the Asian community, you have them here, they'll support the Sangha. And I'm like, why should it just be the Asian community? You know, like, why not all Australians? Like, thinking that someone else is going to make it happen and not us. And then it got me thinking, you know, this idea of apathy, of doing nothing, is a form of violence, you know, because I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, in the end, you won't remember the voices of your foes, but the silence of your friends, you know. And I just thought, as someone who, look, I have white privilege, I know it now. As a white person growing up in Australia, I never experienced racism. I never experienced the extreme disadvantages of being Aboriginal or being disabled or being experiencing age discrimination or, you know, being LGBTQI, experiencing that kind of discrimination. I was like middle class, white. I ticked all the boxes to have a good life, you know. But a few things happened to me that made me start to understand what privilege is and what disenfranchised disadvantage is, and that those things are real for the people who experience them. Like I grew up in a country town and we didn't have any people from the Asian community there. So I remember the first time I saw an Asian person, I was like, you know, and just stupid things, like the stupid things, like I've heard people say, you know, like, just the stupid things people say, and I had those prejudices in me, passed down from generations, you know, not necessarily out of hatred, but just out of stupidity, ignorance, you know. And then there was this one girl at our school who was Aboriginal, and she pretended to be from Fiji because there was such a bad idea about Aboriginal people being lazy and unemployed, you know. I mean, the idea that they're traumatized and that we committed genocide against them and that their women were raped and that there's a reason why they're in shock and that they have alcoholism and so many social problems because of the trauma of the genocide we committed against them. This was never talked about. You know, only, they've got social problems, they're living in poverty, they're unemployed, they won't help themselves. And it's like, well, what is the cause? How did this become this way? It's the result of trauma. It's the result of the violence that was done to them. And how white people whitewash history, his story, you know, and patriarchy rewrites history, you know. And then I just started researching, you know, why poverty, why disadvantage, why racism, why trauma. All kinds of, everybody is a result of social, spiritual, economic, cultural, psychological conditions. You know, an individual is not just separate, permanent, independent. Mahayana Buddhism says this in its teaching on what do they call it? Interdependent origination. This arises because of that. This is because of that. This is in relation to that. Everything is conditioned, and every result has a cause. Everything is interconnected through the net of cause and effect, you know. And how are we a part of this net of cause and effect? What part are we playing in the empowerment or oppression of others? You know, and how has our privilege contributed to others' disadvantage? And how can we, you know, by being aware, how can we stop perpetuating inequality, structural violence? You know, because to not address your privilege and to not look at history and why people are the way they are, disadvantaged, disenfranchised, is to continue the violence. Actually, to do nothing is to perpetuate this violence. You know, to not acknowledge that. I mean, if you look at this idea of interdependent origination or causality, you know, this is because that is. For example, say you have a medium height person in the room. On their own, they are neither tall nor short, okay? But someone who is taller comes into the room and suddenly they become short, you know? But then someone who is shorter comes into the room and suddenly in comparison to that person, they're medium size. So it's very relative, you know? This is because that. We're all affecting each other. And therefore, as I've said many times, and you'll hear me say again and again, happiness is not just a personal matter, it's a communal matter. Because we affect each other. If one person in a family is suicidal and depressed, or violent and abusive, it affects the happiness of everyone in the family. You know, we can impact each other. We can destroy each other's lives, or we can lift each other up. Together we rise. We have this capacity. Love has this capacity to nurture, to heal, to transform, to change lives. So we need to look at our actions. St. Francis of Assisi said, words are good, but only as good as the actions they produce. Okay? In terms of Buddhism, we are not, in the West, we are not very active. We are navel-gazing, and we are self-absorbed. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. You know? If we look at the Christians, they're doing so much more for society. It's kind of an embarrassment to Buddhists, actually. You know? And people will say, well, Buddhism is an inner practice, and that is very important. That rich contemplative tradition that we have in Buddhism is our wealth. It is why many people have left Christianity and come to Buddhism. You know, from my own point of view, look, I think Christianity is great, and I'm not dissing it. I'm just saying this was what worked for me. Okay, I have a lot of respect, especially for people like Thomas Merton and St. Francis and Mother Teresa. But what drew me to Buddhism, like I grew up Catholic, and there was this, we were told to be good, but we weren't told how to be good. And we were told, you know, you should be selfless, you should serve others, you should care for the poor. But without addressing the ego and the self-centered agenda and the negative emotions, you're just kind of being almost violent against yourself, suppressing yourself and your inclinations. I must be good, I must be good, I must get rid of these things, but not actually working with those things. So that inner science of Buddhism is important from a Buddhist point of view. Working with those negative emotions, like trying to save the world when you are still a complete mess yourself, can have some bad results. Trying to serve others without self-awareness, without self-care, can also be quite dangerous. You know. So we need self-awareness and we need self-care, and we need to look at ourselves before we engage in before we engage with trying to make the world a better place. We have to we have to have a spiritual practice. We have to have some equilibrium of mind. We have to look at our prejudices and our internalized white cisgender patriarchy and white supremacy. We have to. Otherwise we're just going to be like that patronizing white person going in to help the poor, disempowered, you know, colonialization, whatever, you know, the disadvantaged people less than us, and not understanding how our privilege is already feeding into their disadvantage, and not owning that, not taking responsibility for that. You know, the person who doesn't know their own darkness and tries to do good, and not seeing that we are all part of the darkness. We are all part of that. We all have the capacity for violence, for anger, but we also have the capacity for love. And we need to know our own darkness, and we need to work with that to grow and transform something good. You know, otherwise we become part of the problem. This duality is a problem. This idea of me and them, good and bad. You know, when I was an environmental activist in my young years, you know, chaining myself to trees and you know, an alternate person going, oh, those straights, you know, those people who work for big fossil fuel corporations, they're the baddies and we're the goodies. You know, but I really wasn't seeing the interconnectedness there. I was not seeing, I'm living on these people's tax dollars because I'm on welfare. And, you know, I'm lighting up my tally-ho cigarette made from an Indonesian rainforest. And those people are not 100% evil. They just want a job to feed their kids and pay off their mortgage. And they just happen to get a job with this country and this company. And they, you know, they see, I mean, society has a need for affordable energy. You know, society needs certain things, like the trains to run and the water to come out of the tap and all of these things. I've seen what it's like in countries where the water doesn't come out of the tap and the water arrives filthy and brown in your bucket, and you line up for an hour or 2 hours a day to get it, and you walk 10 kilometers to get it. I've seen what life is like without that development, you know. Development is not always a bad thing. Development is necessary. Infrastructure is necessary. But how you do it and what is the cost of that, it is important, you know. So I wasn't seeing the part I was playing in, you know, that I was part of the problem. Because I turned on my electric light, you know. I was wearing clothes. Like I thought, oh yeah, my clothes are coming from some boho hippie shop. You know, they're spiritual. And then my friend said to me one day, what's better about your clothes just because they got a rainbow on them? They were made in a sweatshop just like everybody else's clothes. And I'm like, oh, it's true. It's true. I was like, oh. You know. And so we have to see we're part of the problem. You know. I mean, Pema Chodron tells this great story, like, she's like, there's always someone in a retreat center who will annoy you and press your buttons, you know? And you drive all the blame into them. And you know, she calls them Juan or Juanita. And she said, you know, there's this Juan or Juanita who never washes up their cups at the retreat center, you know? And they're so annoying, and all the evils of the world come from this person. You know, just even they breathe too heavy, and they're shifting in meditation, and their heavy breathing annoy you, you know, and somehow all the woes of the world are from this person, you know. And then she said, and you know, repeatedly this person, Juan or Juanita, never washed their cup and plate and spoon, and I was just building up this inner rage against them. And one day I looked in the sink to see who was not washing up their cup day after day. And I turned over the cup and it had Pema written on it. You know, realizing she'd been blaming this person, but she had not seen her own unwashed cup. You know, we all have issues, unwashed cups that we're not looking at. We all have darkness that we're not looking at. Like, we were blaming these men in the Vietnam War, you know, we said, the peace movement, right? Actually, you know, there's this classic picture from the 70s of a hippie putting a flower in the barrel of a gun of some soldier in America. And the soldier felt that was an act of violence that dehumanized him, because He'd grown up with a different set of values. He'd been told it was noble to fight for your country and to defend women and children. And that's what that's the story they were sold. You know, that communism is a danger to the world and they're going to come and you won't be able to afford houses anymore and your middle class lifestyle and your right to own property will be destroyed. And he later on joined the peace movement, you know. It's interesting that capitalism has now destroyed our ability to own a house and taken our middle class lifestyle. Not communism. No, I'm not a communist, but it is interesting that all the things we feared communism would do has actually happened under capitalism. So if you are going to engage in social activism, you need to look at your own darkness and your own issues. And as a man, I think men need to look at how their privilege has impacted women, the history. I mean, people say, oh, it's fine now. What are they talking about? You know, like a Tibetan man, the other day on Facebook, we were talking about this sexual scandal of some Lama who'd slept with multiple female students, and those female students had felt that it was a violation of their power as a teacher. And one Tibetan man said, and these women had taken this Lama to court for a sexual assault. And it had happened multiple times over a period of 20 years. You know, young girls who were offered as volunteers by their parents, like an 18 or a 19-year-old who ended up being taken advantage of sexually by this leader. And one Tibetan man said, you know, it wasn't rape, so why, you know, he's not a monk, he's not, you know, got vows of celibacy, so what's wrong with it? And I said, well, what's wrong with it is that these parents offered their young daughters as volunteers. They didn't offer them as sex objects and concubines to this Lama. And this Lama was not having a loving relationship with one person, but using his power to push these young girls into serving his physical needs. And this Tibetan man said online, only fat, miserable feminists take men to court about sexual assault and make up lies. And I said, so you're saying 24 women's testimony in court is a lie, and that one man who had a huge amount of power should not be held accountable for his actions?
That's equivalent to a teacher having a sexual relationship with a young girl. It's not much different, is there? Except that there's a whole lot of ideology of Buddhism.
Yeah,
connected to
it's
that
a sacred
role.
union and it's a consort.
But it's still the same type of...
Yeah, it's well, they were above age.
Wrong use of power.
Yeah, totally. So anyway, power corrupts, you know, and that's why in Buddhist...
Wrong use of power.
Yeah, that's why in Buddhist communities we have to examine our own issues, thank you, before we try to help others and before we take on roles of leadership.
Yeah.
You know, and people say there is no issue of gender equality now, you know, but women have only had the vote for 100 years. And women only own 10% of the world's land. And 70% of those who live in poverty are women and girls. And even Western women who go to court accusing a man of sexual assault, most of these cases are dismissed and no justice is given, even in this day and age. And women are still afraid to walk the street at night. And women are still raped.
Certainly in other countries. Does that happen here as well, you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Domestic violence costs us millions of dollars every year. They say something like 300,000 women in Australia experience domestic violence.
There's a lot about domestic violence now.
Yeah, and rape.
It's becoming,
Yeah, and actually women over 65 are the largest group of people increasing their levels of homelessness. There are 34,000 homeless women in Australia, or maybe more, you know, because there's hidden homelessness. There's people who are staying with friends and family who can't afford their own apartment. So these issues have still not really, they're still there. You know, they've been improved, but they're still there. You know, so we have to look, trying to put ourselves in another person's shoes. You know, how not everyone starts, you know, if you think of life as a marathon or as a 100-meter race, not everyone, certain people start ahead of others, you know. And there are certain structural disadvantages if you're born female, if you're born a person of colour, if you're born disabled, if you're born in poverty, you know, that you have to overcome. So not everyone starts at the same place in life, you know, and developing empathy for that, you know, developing sensitivity towards that. And that, I mean, to me, this all ties in with the Bodhisattva ideal found in Buddhism. Wow, the time has gone by really quick. Can it be true?
Really enjoyed.
Yeah, the Bodhisattva ideal, who knows what it is? Nobody? Come on, what is a Bodhisattva? Tell me.
I know what it is. They haven't described words in it. You know as well, don't you, Tony?
It's helping another human being.
Yeah, it's kind of being compassionate to others, mainly. And
So then wouldn't Mother Teresa be a Bodhisattva?
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think.
Absolutely.
I say so.
My understanding is there's, I guess, two types of bodhisattvas. So those who are fully enlightened and choose to come back when they otherwise could be in nirvana in order to help all sentient beings, and then those who maybe aren't quite fully realized and yet essentially have the same intention of relieving suffering, helping people to wisdom, and that in this and future lives, helping sentient beings.
So what's the difference between a Bodhisattva and just a nice person who helps others?
Well, I guess there's an assumption that they have a very high level of spiritual awareness such that their capacity to do it is hopefully a little bit greater.
Isn't the intention what gives birth to bodhisattvas? What is the intention that gives birth to bodhisattvas?
Compassion?
It's called bodhicitta.
Yes. And certainly Mother
Yeah.
Teresa and others can have it. I don't think they have to be Buddhist.
You could say that in a vague sense, but from a philosophical point of view, bodhicitta is the wish to liberate others from the wheel of birth and death and place them in enlightenment. So it's not just a vague wish that others be happy or free of suffering, but it is the wish that I myself will undertake this, you know, because they're like helpless children drowning in the water and I can swim. Because they've been here a really long time and they're not doing a great job getting themselves out of it. If anything, they are licking honey from the razor blade compulsively, and they can't. They're like an addict, samsaraholic. They can't give up the dream. They can't wake up from the dream. So I myself will undertake. See, Theravada, you can say in the simplest sense, is like they're trying to wake themselves up from the dream of samsara, from the dream of that this reality is real and material and permanent, and seeing themselves as separate to everything else, of just following whatever unenlightened appearance comes into their mind, you know, and constantly seeking sensual pleasure and gratification and reconfirmation of this separate, permanent, self-grasping existence, right? An arhat is someone who is someone who aspires to be an arhat, to get out of the wheel of birth and death. They're seeking to wake up from the dream themselves. Whereas a bodhisattva will be like, but that's not enough because everybody else is also sinking. Everybody else is also drowning. So I have to not only wake myself up, but wake them up from the dream. Because they can't help themselves. They're not doing a great job of getting liberated. And they've been my mother again and again and again. And they are many, and I am just one. Shantideva, who is a great Bengali Buddhist saint from India around the 8th century. He said, all the joy the world contains, it has come through cherishing others. All the misery the world contains, it has come through only obsessing about myself. You know, so if you come from a Judeo-Christian background, you could use a statement like this to beat yourself up and go, okay, screw you, self-cherishing, I'm just going to shut you all your needs down and you just shut up and I'm just going to be selfless and serve all beings until I die of exhaustion, you know, like this martyr-like mind. And that is also an unbalanced view. That is not right view. Okay, we shouldn't use the Dharma to beat ourselves up. We should use the Dharma to realize there is no self to beat up. Now that's an ultimate view. Okay? And you can't just say, your suffering doesn't matter because there is no you. That's a problem.
Jesus was one of the greatest bodhisattvas that we've had.
Perhaps. But was he...
and Buddha was as well, obviously.
Well, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, that might be problematic because was he talking about liberation from birth and death? I mean, look at the philosophy he taught. It was talking about self, it was talking about God, it was talking about soul. He talked about compassion, but he also said...
He didn't use compassion, he used love.
Yeah, but he was also saying there is a God and there is a soul, and you are created by God.
Well, it depends on your understanding of these things.
Well, in terms of what is actually the written teachings of Jesus.
But you know, from the heart, he was from the heart, wasn't he?
I think Jesus had many bodhisattva-like qualities, but I think I'm trying to... I think it's important not to be wishy-washy in terms of like what is Buddhist philosophy, and what is the definition of a Buddha.
If we talk about Buddhism.
Yeah, and what is a bodhisattva? What is their intention? I'd say he's bodhisattva-like. I don't know if he's a Buddha though.
Isn't it good in the Western world to have a few things that are non-Buddhist that are actually explaining the Buddhist concepts?
Yeah, but I mean, there's some fundamental differences between Christianity and Buddhism. One is God,
sure,
one is self.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But they're also, I mean, both are a Buddha and Jesus, they're both wonderful people.
They were. But whether Jesus was a Buddha or not is another question.
I guess an important question would be, was Jesus teaching people the path to enlightenment, or just to be more loving?
Yeah.
He probably taught special disciples the path to enlightenment. The ordinary person, he didn't. I think there's two different teachings there.
Okay, so...
anyhow, I'm sorry, I'm kind of distracted.
That's okay, that's okay. God, what was I saying before that? It's all good.
You said you understand what it is.
We're talking about interaction, aren't we? And you know, that's why...
Sure.
Kind of in the Western world, I do feel that you do need to bring up things that people are familiar with.
I think there's totally room for a dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism, and I actually think in terms of social engagement, we can learn a lot from Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I think we were talking about what is a bodhisattva and what is their intention. A bodhisattva is not just someone who wants to do good things, but is someone who has the intention to take on the burden of liberating others from the wheel of birth and death. through practicing the 6 perfections, you know. And I was talking about the danger of bashing yourself over the head with these Bodhisattva teachings, of thinking that you have to completely suppress your own needs and your own well-being in order to serve others. And that is not a healthy balance. Because while you're an unenlightened being in this world, with the idea of a self, even though it may not be a right view, it's a view most of us have. So we have to manage this dream of self well before we can transcend it. You have to care for yourself, have enough resources, have a healthy lifestyle, have good energy, good friends, emotional support before you can. You have to be okay and surviving in your own life before you can help others. But it's often the really interesting thing that I find about social engagement. It's often the people who are the most broken, who have suffered being marginalised, who have suffered heartbreak, who have suffered mental illness and bad health, who have suffered poverty, that want to help others, that turn up caring. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Like, you see this symbolism in Christianity of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the bleeding hands and the crown of thorns, and you think, wow, that doesn't look, it looks a little hardcore. But I think there is a kind of idea that in there that you can only love others when you understand them, when you understand their suffering, when you can bleed with them, you know. When you, only to the extent that you have embraced and transformed your own brokenness, your own suffering, your own brokenheartedness, can you love others. And Trungpa Rinpoche called this the genuine heart of sadness. That was his term for bodhicitta, you know. So does that mean that as a bodhisattva you're going to be really unhappy and you're going to be bleeding with others and crying all the time? Like St. Francis cried a lot. He saw suffering and he cried a lot. He also loved a lot and had a lot of joy. I don't think in the long term your bodhicitta should make you suffer more or should make you miserable. And I don't think you should take on an issue that crushes you, or you should use an issue to beat yourself up and exhaust yourself and bankrupt yourself, because you can't help others if you're miserable. But at the same time, as an unenlightened being in a relative sense, to help others in disadvantage requires being open to their pain a little bit. Because only when you understand how they see things can you really be of use to them. Because when, you know, we have this idea, some people have this idea in social work that I know better than you, I'm an expert, I know what you need, I've got a degree. You know, I've got a degree in homelessness. I've got a degree in gender inequality. I, as a man, know what you as a woman need. You know, I, as a white person, know what you, as a person of colour, need. You know, like what we did in the 50s to the Aboriginals, you know, oh yeah, that teach them how to mow a lawn and keep a nice house and bake scones and go to church on Sunday, and that's, you know, a good life. A good life for who? What about their culture? What about their wisdom? What about respecting where they're coming from? You know, we have no understanding of that. We totally whitewashed that. We took that to the edge of destruction. You know.
We're still continuing to do it.
We're still doing it. You know.
It's a crime shame.
Yeah, yeah. So to be ready to engage in a dialogue about social justice means we have to check our privilege. And it means we have to be ready to get down on the level of those people that we're trying to help and ask them and respect their wisdom. They're not morons. They've just had some bad luck. You know, and they are, there are many, what are the conditions that are leading to their disempowerment? And how can we change that? Because like I said, everyone is having the intersection of psychological, social, cultural, economic conditions that make them who they are. So if you change the conditions, mental, social, physical, spiritual, cultural, they can also change. You see? So what is the situation of their disempowerment? What is wounding them? What is disempowering them? How can we address that? And getting on their level and asking, what do you need? Rather than us telling them what they need. And often they need to be heard. They need to go from being victims to being like activists. Like there is this amazing charity in India called Acid Attack Fighters. And there are girls who had acid thrown on their face and they have terrible deformities because some man wanted to marry them and they said no. And then he threw acid on them to save his honor. You know, and like, I can't have you, so no one can have you. I mean, that is the very definition of possessiveness, you know, and seeing a woman as an object, not as a human being. Those women's lives have been destroyed. You know, many of them are blind. Many of them had to live as beggars. You know, some of them had the skin melted and the neck was stuck to the shoulder like that, you know. And whenever they go out in the street, people stare at them and yell abuse. And they can't get a job. So they have to make a living as beggars, or they hide away in their houses. And that means that the person who threw acid on them has won. Because they've destroyed them, that's what they wanted, you know. But what these girls did with some social workers was to say, you know, you can throw acid on me, but you won't destroy me. You know, all you've done is destroy your own humanity. I'm still here. And I'm going to reclaim my own humanity, and I'm going to stand up for women's rights, and I'm going to address the mindset, the toxic masculinity, the toxic patriarchy that causes a man to think that that this is okay, that a woman is his property and his right. And they talk about those issues in India, which are very big issues actually, in terms of men setting women on fire, mother-in-laws setting up their daughter-in-laws on fire for dowry. You know, these are big issues around the world, actually, violence against women. And these women are just kind of really strong, and they're not broken. They've been empowered, which is so amazing, you know, when someone can lose almost everything and then still be luminous, bright, hopeful. How can we do that? How can we help these broken people? And get on their level and say, what do you need? What can I do? Rather than me turning up and saying, I know everything, this is what you need. Me getting on their level, feeling a bit of their pain and saying, I'm here for you. The door of my heart is open to you. How can I help you? It doesn't mean that you drown with them. Drowning with them is also not wisdom. If you are completely exhausted and burnt out, you can't help anyone. So you dive in and you dive out. You engage with these people who are suffering, and then you come back to your refuge, your place of peace, your practice, your life. Because if you drown with them, you're not helping them either. But you also need to be prepared a little bit to open the door of your heart and have a little taste of what life is like for them, without drowning, without it completely overwhelming you. Okay, you see the difference between touching someone else's suffering and drowning in it. And that's why communication and community is so important, because you learn other people's point of view. And that's why social media and echo chambers are so problematic. And that's why we are becoming more and more divided, because we are just in an echo chamber of what we like and people who agree with us, which is not representative of the world and is making us more polarized and divided and more intolerant. Look at America. Extremely liberal liberals and extremely badly informed conservatives. You know, really. I mean, I think some people in the Bible Belt have this idea that feminists are women who want to kill babies and have, you know, like destroy marriages and, you know, castrate men. Really, like I've read some articles, you know, that are just like, where where are you getting your, man haters, feminazis? Where are you getting your, have you actually spoken to a real feminist? And also with these alt-right people who are basically it's just a cool way of saying a Nazi, a white supremacist. Have you actually spoken to a person of colour? Do you know that they don't have horns and they're human beings and they don't just arrive going, I'm going to destroy your white middle-class way of life? And do you know how it feels to experience that kind of hatred and to not feel safe? And how would you feel if someone turned up in a white bedsheet with a horse and torched your house and raped your wife? How would you feel? How does that feel from their point of view? How does it feel for hundreds of years to be enslaved? To have people make assumptions about you because of your appearance? How does that feel? If you could really taste that, if we could taste for 1 minute what it feels like to be disadvantaged and disempowered, we would never do it. Because as a human being, we all want to live in safety and peace. And when you understand that the person you're hurting is as human as you, you can no longer do that. That is why it is so important to check our privilege, to examine our prejudice, and to listen to other people's voices and experience, to embrace diversity and understand the common ground of humanity that we all share. This heart opening, this empathy building, this compassion is what will end war and violence and discrimination and inequality in the world. And it's not reached by demonizing men, or by demonizing white people, or by demonizing cisgender straight people. But it does require an uncomfortable dialogue that makes us examine our privilege. It's uncomfortable sometimes, it's painful to sometimes hear the voices of people who have been marginalized. It's challenging. When I go onto forums of African American people, and I hear the way they talk about white people, it's hard for me sometimes, and I want to defend myself, and I want to make it about me. When I hear them say, white people have been killing us for years, and, they all hate us, and I don't even talk to white people about racism anymore, and, what about Selma? What about Martin Luther King? And then a part of me wants to defend white people and go, hey, do you know 6 people died in those protests in Selma? 6 white people. And I'm like, but how many black people have died over hundreds of years? And why should 6 white people dying make a difference in terms of the gross, huge inequality? How can 6 people make up for hundreds of years of violence? And what I need to do is just wait. Why am I talking? W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? Wait. Before you want to defend yourself, before you want to tone police someone. Tone policing is a way that we interrupt someone and we shut down the uncomfortable truth of what they're saying. Sometimes talking about racism, talking about gender inequality, talking about poverty requires us to listen to some uncomfortable truths. And being prepared to listen. And sometimes it's like Thich Nhat Hanh says with mindful communication, sometimes it's too much. Like you reach a point where it's overload and you just can't listen anymore. So you have to say sorry. Like give them time, as much time as you can, and then take it home and think about it before you respond. Because those people are in a lot of pain. If you're a person of colour, disabled, disenfranchised, living in a homeless shelter, you're going to be bitter. I'm not saying all people of colour are bitter. I'm not saying all disabled people are bitter. It's a generalisation. Dangerous, dangerous. And sometimes it feels like you can't say anything that's right. Like you go onto some of these forums and it's like, oh my God, I've just made 100 social justice mistakes and I'm just, like you're afraid to say anything. But that's also making it about you. Just turn up and be a witness and try to be an ally. Try to empower them, give them a voice. Use your privilege to give others who are disempowered a voice. We all make mistakes, But we try. The point is we begin to have a dialogue. We begin to talk about it. We begin to climb down from our ivory tower, you know, and not wait for someone else to do it. Like those people last night, you know, someone else will support Western monastics, not us. Asian people will support Western monastics, not us. This imaginary Buddhist community who will do something, it's us. You know, so if we don't do it, who will do it? We have to be the change we want to see. In whatever, you know, that doesn't mean like, often, as I said, the people who turn up and want to do these things are the poorest, you know, broken people, the people who have suffered these things, have the heart to do it. You know, the people who have experienced these things are the ones who have sensitivity to it and want to do it. You know, and they burn themselves out. There are a lot of good-hearted, we call them bleeding-hearted liberals in some circles. The people who want to turn up and do these are often the people with the least resources to do it. You know. But it's okay. It's okay. You just start where you can. You start where you are. You know, and you always remember every step to be as kind to yourself as you are to others. But not kind in a way that strokes your prejudices. You know, like it's okay for me to not do anything, you know, because I'm feeling uncomfortable. It's okay for me to just, I can't listen to that right now. You know? I mean, look, there are times where you just can't. Like, if you're a rape victim and you're traumatized, you're re-traumatized by that issue. If you're someone suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, and you go and you hear other veterans talk about war, that could send you into a suicidal spiral. So for your mental health, you're not ready to deal with that. You have to protect your mental health and your mental well-being. But if you're not someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder, you're just someone who is middle class and never heard those kind of stories before. Breathe in and breathe out and open your heart a little bit. And you'd be amazed how big your heart can grow. And you would be amazed how resilient you can become. And if you dip into that ocean of compassion again and again, you would be amazed how one person can make a difference and change the course of history. You know, you do what you can, but what you can, if you practice bodhicitta, if you meditate on compassion, if you see, everybody is just like me, everybody is just like my own kind mother. Your capacity to do and to be of service and to hold space for others who are in pain, your capacity for that also grows. You know, but just don't transfer your issues onto others. Don't practice transference. Because you're in pain, therefore the whole world is in pain, and you're like seeking out others' pain to validate your own unresolved issues. It's also a problem. You know. But people who are in activism are often people who did experience these things, you know. And that's okay, you know, because you've had it, your own encounter with suffering has opened your heart to others. You know, a lot of people who hear me talk about stories from India, like the things, I guess I've become a little desensitized in the sense of seeing a person begging with a stump in the street doesn't shock me anymore. Seeing a person with leprosy, a biblical disease, doesn't shock me anymore. Seeing a child begging on the street makes me sad, but doesn't shock me anymore. So sometimes I'll tell people stories of the things I've seen and what I've experienced, and they'll be like, oh. You know, especially blonde white women in yoga centres in Avalon. Bless them. They're so positive, you know. They're so full of light and buoyant, and they have a lot of optimism because things are not so hard for them. Whereas if you turn up in, you know, Rudy Hill, Mount Druitt, Campbelltown, the people are a little rougher, you know, and they're not so shocked because their partner died of alcoholism and their daughter's working as a sex worker and their son committed suicide. Not saying that everyone, but they've seen, you know, they've lived more on the edge. People who are disenfranchised, disadvantaged, see more extreme on the edge things. You know, the aim it seems that way to me anyway. The aim of the capitalist society is to put people who are not economically productive on the fringe, to push them out of the city, far to the edge of the city where there's the worst facilities. We do it to elderly people as well. You know, we push them out, we marginalise them, we disenfranchise them. The same as veterans. You know, they were defending this system, and then they are scapegoated as the cause of the violence. The cause of the violence was the search for cheap oil, or the political agenda of taking more land. You know, but they are scapegoated. You are a killer. You know, they are scapegoated, but they were just really how can I say? They were the gun. They weren't the one holding. They weren't the one pointing the gun. They were just being used by the system. You know, and not to say that. I mean, there are certainly interventions like a UN peacekeeper or places where soldiers are actually needed and necessary, or police officers, you know, protecting women in domestic violence situations. Not to say that everyone in the army or the police is, you know, a killer or whatever, you know. But there are often people who are used by the system and then spat out by the system, and we also marginalise them. We don't want to see it. We don't want to see mental illness. We don't want to see homelessness. We don't want to see social dysfunction, so we hide it away. Death, we also hide it away. I mean, it's crazy. We drain bodies of blood and pump them full of chemicals, and they look better dead than they were alive. You know, and it's like, these bodies are never going to rot. You know, I mean, we can't accept it. We can't accept what's really going on. But if you're a social worker, I don't know, maybe I'm a little weird, but I just want to see something real. And seeing something real puts me in touch with my humanity, makes me feel alive. In a world where people are not authentic, you're missing a lot. We hide our hearts from each other. And I mean, sometimes it's too much. Other people's pain is too much. So sometimes that little bit of professional distance is necessary and good, but sometimes it helps to open up and to be a bit authentic. It's rewarding. It's called human intimacy, emotional intimacy, human relationships. It can be painful too, when other people's unresolved anger and issues are put on you. It can be painful, and you have to step back in times of that when it's too much for you as a carer and say, this is not my monkeys, not my circus. But there's a time where you just realise, oh, my monkey is my circus. I've played a part in this. You know, I've played a part in this. And I am society. And those people are society. And a society is only as good as how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. You know, Buddhism is us. And if Buddhists are suffering, if people are suffering, if we claim to have compassion, how can we do nothing? Compassion is a verb. Karma is not destiny. Karma is not an excuse. It's your karma. Be apathetic. Or another thing, like I read a really good article on Facebook the other day. It was called how secular mindfulness is making us accept the unacceptable. And it's about how mindfulness has been used by corporations to make employees accept more stressful situations, working longer hours for less pay.
It's been an overused word now.
Oh yeah, totally bastardized.
Yeah.
And it's like, we gave you a stress relief course, so now stress is your problem. And we're going to still squeeze you. We're going to use this spiritual teaching of liberation to squeeze you for more productiveness and make you produce more.
That was tricycle, wasn't it?
I think so. I can't remember. I think so. But it's like a perversion, you know, because mindfulness is actually supposed to make you self-aware and care for yourself. It's not meant to make you a more productive cog in the capitalist system. And it's not meant to make someone squeeze you or exploit you, you know, or use it as an excuse to be apathetic and to internalize, to just accept. This is something we hear in Buddhism, accept. And you know, it's like everything is your problem, everything is your mind's problem. You know, everything is in your mind, everything is a projection of your mind. So if you want to fix the problem, you have to fix your mind. Well, that's true to a certain extent. But a person in a wheelchair's problem, the fact that they can't get the train because there's no lift, is not a problem in their mind. It's a problem in the system. It's a physical problem. So that's where you have to address it. If hierarchy of needs, you can't, it's patronizing. It's patronizing to tell a disadvantaged person that their very real physical problem is in their head. It's a head screw. And it's a way that what happens is, in all religions, someone had a vision of the truth. And then the state appropriated it and used it to justify the status quo. You know, so acceptance and transformation became a way for people to justify exploitation and disadvantage and inequality. I mean, in America there's this idea of a meritocracy, that you work hard and you'll succeed. And if you don't succeed, it's your fault. Nothing to do with the system. You know, for 100 years, black people couldn't get a mortgage. No one would loan them the money. So is their poverty their own fault, their own lack of hard work? No one works harder than poor people. Have you seen these women in India carrying bricks on their head?
Wow.
You know? And the men sitting there with a cigarette and a chai, saying, go there, do that, do that. You know? Have you seen the women in Africa carrying water for 10 kilometers? Carrying sticks on their head, carrying a child in one arm, a goat in the other, and a bloody huge stack of sticks on their head. And saying the poor don't work, the poor are lazy, the poor are poor because they're lazy. Come on. That's how we whitewash inequality and poverty. Yeah.
You sound like a sociologist.
Or maybe a socialist. I mean, what I've talked about this morning is more social justice oriented than Buddhist oriented, but I hope you can see the intersection. And then after lunch, I'll talk more about the Buddhist approach to social justice. What I've talked about this morning is more about recognizing privilege, about recognizing that we need to respect the people we're trying to help, that we need to understand and open our heart, and that they actually often have the skills and know what is best to help themselves. You know, and how can we bring these issues to light, and just, you know, understanding that if we want change, we have to be part of the change. And we have to accept our own darkness and look at how we ourselves are contributing to the system of injustice. And also, I guess, from a Buddhist point of view, samsara will never be perfect. But that's not an excuse to let things stay really bad. Because, you know, everything good that has happened in the last 100 or 500 years, like, you know, democracy, like workers' rights, like the vote for women, like birth control, like minimum pay, like no child labour, has all, the 1% did not just say, take it, we want you to have it. No, women had to blow things up. Women had to die. Women had to, you know, lose their jobs and end up homeless to advocate for the vote. They were called suffragettes. You know, people had to talk about the real reasons for war to not be considered an ethical thing. People had to be informed for those changes to happen. People had to fight for those things. Those things were not given on a platter, because people don't want to give up their privilege, isn't it? So sometimes you have to stand up for those things. Nothing, very, very seldom that good things happen without some kind of agitation. The Berlin Wall fell, that was amazing, because people just realized it wasn't working, and it fell without too much fighting or effort, you know, because people just reached a point where they realized this just is not working. We don't want this, you know. But other things, most of those things, people had to fight for them. You have to be part of the change you want to see. But you also have to care for yourself. So this process of self-inquiry should lead to us questioning, and looking at a better world, creating a better world, and how we can participate in that should lead to action. But action without contemplation is like a car without a driver. You need a driver, you need wisdom driving you. Because without self-reflection, you won't see how you won't know the best way to help others. And without contemplation, you won't have the energy to maintain your work to help others. You will run dry, you will burn out. And there is a hell of a lot of issues. It's massive and overwhelming. So how are you going to lift yourself up? How are you going to come back to that every day and face that wall of injustice? Someone said to me today, we were talking about gender inequality in Buddhism, and one of these older women, I think she's about 80, and she said, Tenzin Palmo, this very famous nun who spent 12 years in a cave, took a film crew to interview the Dalai Lama in the 90s. And, she said Tibetan nuns were illiterate, they were working in the field, they were having a very terrible situation. And, Buddha gave women full ordination. Why are you not letting us take it? She was addressing all of these uncomfortable issues. She was speaking in an assertive, slightly aggressive way, in a way that people don't usually talk to the Dalai Lama. And he was just giggling, I think that was his nervous giggling, but it wasn't appropriate to that situation, and he wasn't addressing the issue. And it actually made him look bad. And this older woman said, the Dalai Lama's hands are tied politically. He couldn't make those changes. He couldn't offer full ordination. He couldn't speak out against other Tibetan Lamas whose consensus he relies on to remain a leader. And I said, I don't think it's as hopeless as that. I think because Jetsunma, Tenzin Palmo asked those uncomfortable questions, it's like a wall that we're chipping away at, and our understanding grows, and our voice gets bigger. And one generation carries on the work of the previous generation, and should learn from the previous generation. Often we don't. And because of the foundation she started about talking about gender inequality in Buddhism, the next generation was slightly better off. And people are now talking about it and saying it's not acceptable. And the Karmapa has now said full ordination is possible for women, and that Tibetan nuns should be educated and Western nuns should be educated. So I don't think it's as hopeless as she tried and she failed. You chip away at the wall a little bit, and you chip away a bit more, and eventually you create a momentum that breaks the wall down. And you have to look at it, social justice, as a marathon, not a 100-meter race. So you have to be prepared to work for change over a long period of time. And find joy in the little things, in the everyday present moment, peace, returning to your true home, taking refuge in the present moment. Because every day is a day that won't come again. And if you spend your whole life only seeing the cup half empty and not seeing, the cup is also half full, that is also a balanced state of mind, so that you don't completely lose yourself in the suffering, but you have a balanced mind. You're buoyant, that you water seeds of happiness in yourself and others. Like when I used to do aged care, and it was pretty hard work, really hard on the back, very bad wages, and the people in the nursing home weren't very happy, pretty lonely. I would find just making a joke with them. Some of them couldn't even remember 5 minutes what happened. They had dementia. Like there was this woman every day who would say 100 times a day, I don't know where I am. It was very irritating, But I would just make a joke with her, and I'd just talk to her for a minute, a light-hearted moment where she suddenly was a human being and not a dementia patient. She was suddenly a human being. I did something that made her feel human, and not just as a client, like a clinical thing, like you're a client. you know, and you're something wrong with you, you know. This is your home. I'm here to care for you. How can I make your life easier? You know, how can I make you feel like a human being? And how can I make myself feel like a human being doing this hard job? Just a little bit of humor. So take refuge in that present moment experience, that peace. And even if you're walking through neck deep in shit, remember that this too shall pass. People always say, how do you live in an Indian slum? How have you done that for a decade? And I'm like, how could I do something that was not meaningful? It was harder for me to work in an office job that had no meaning for me, that was totally comfortable, than it was in an Indian slum. Because in an Indian slum, I'd wake up and I'd be like, it's a challenge. And I'm helping someone. I'm changing lives. You know? So what if it's heartbreaking sometimes? I made a difference. Did I make a difference working in the insurance company? Did it water seeds of joy in me? Not to say, look, we all find our battleground. And your battleground might be a corporate boardroom, or your battleground might be a therapist's office, or your battleground might be a toddler in the park. You know, we all find our issue to advocate for. But if you have, if you know how to nurture compassion and to remember this too shall pass, and to see the other person as a human being and not as a problem to fix, and you water seeds of joy in yourself, you will always have the power you need to continue the path to liberation and to help others. And if you run out of steam, begin again. Go back into the cave for a while. No shame in that. No shame in that. You know, but I don't know, I don't see that human beings can be irrecoverably broken. What I see it as is just a redistribution. Like a crack in the pavement that the weeds, that a beautiful flower can grow through. Old things are broken so new things can take birth. I don't see it as a defeat. You know, I see it as a growth. Terrible things have happened to me. I was almost raped. I was homeless. I was pushed out by Buddhist centers that I'd served. I was told to pray to be reborn as a man. I was told by Tibetan monasteries I was just a tourist, I wasn't a real practitioner. I was even told that by Western Buddhists. I lost my foster daughter. You know, she died from an operation I organized to straighten her spine. I've made mistakes. But there are many things I couldn't change, you know. I couldn't change those things. So the question is it going to destroy me? Or am I going to go back and reflect and see what good things I can take from it? What plants can I grow in the cracks in my heart? What good things? You know, how can I use this as a way to move forward on the path of understanding and compassion? You know, I mean, even the Buddha's life wasn't always perfect. People accused him of rape, sexual misconduct, theft, lying. People were jealous. Someone tried to kill him. People slandered him. It wasn't that he was just unenlightened and he was just a crash dummy with no emotions and no humanity. The first time the Buddha developed compassion was when he was reborn in hell, pulling a cart, and another demon killed his companion who was pulling a cart. And because he tried to help his companion who was pulling a cart in hell, because of that compassion, he died and was reborn in a God realm. You know, so even the Buddha at one point was having an all-time low. You know. Anyway, let's have lunch. I'm really heavy going, aren't I? But it's juicy. I hope it's juicy. I hope you can see that, you know, it's all grist for the mill. It's compost that grows the flowers inside. So don't see it as a problem.
Very good compost.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a way to take something difficult and make it into something positive. A bit like Metta Centre in Bankstown. Bankstown can be a difficult place, you know, a rough place. And it's like a lotus in a sea of fire. It's like a cool refuge in a hot place. Places where there is rough edges need Buddhist centres more than places where everything is going smoothly. Okay, have a good lunch. So maybe we come back in 50 minutes at 10 to 1. No. 10, no.
1:20.
1:20. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What does everyone want for lunch? We can go to the Thai restaurant.
Sounds good.